And then they manually selected a target on the first frame. So you can see here that, see this ellipse that's been put down here and this ellipse that's been put down there? They specified that in advance, and they said go. And that one starts going, and I'm going to say go here, and that one starts going. And I want you to notice, whoops, let's get rid of how well those mean shift models stick to the players, okay? The average number of iterations was only 4. That is, from one frame to another, they had to do the mean shift thing 4 times to track the density. They also worried about scale in terms of looking at how the scale changed. There is, however, another way of thinking about the tracking that I just showed you. Let's not worry too much about the mean shifting part of it, and just this idea of using the color distribution as the matching of the color distribution, the similarity, as a sensor model, okay? Because when we do this mean shift and we're tracking the single peak, we're a little bit back to like our Kalman universe, right? Where the idea was there's a single hypothesis. We could just use this similarity function, the matching function of the color distributions, as the sensor model for particle filtering. That is, your particles spread out, and they want to say, well, what's the probability of getting this sensor measurement if that's actually my state? Well, you can simply say, well, it's just a measure of how close the color distribution is using that Bhattacharya distance or some other way of comparing distributions. And in fact, people have done this, and now I have to show you a totally unfair slide. And the reason it's unfair is this slide I found, I was looking, this is in a presentation given online talking about mean shift. I don't actually know the source of this picture, so I can't give you the reference to go look it up, etc. And then they show this interesting thing where the mean shift is tracking this cute little kid and then falls apart. Okay? Now, why would it fall apart? This is a little bit sneaky. You'll notice this brown envelope, cardboard box in the background. It has some color distributions similar to the face of the kid. So if you've ever thought little kids are really pretty much cardboard boxes, you're right. Or at least that's what mean shift says. And then what they showed is that if you used a particle tracker, particle filter tracker, it falls off a little bit. See, it fell off, but then it catches back on. That's what particle filters do, right? They entertain multiple hypotheses, so even if some weird hypothesis is looking good, as long as the real one eventually becomes better, it'll come back to it, and that's what it's showing here. But basically, the idea is you can use the similarity function of the two color distributions as your sensor model for a particle filter. And this relates to this idea of what I said before, that particle filters really are pretty flexible. You can pull out whatever sensor model you want to use as long as you can put it within this Bayesian framework of P of z given x. One more little a specific tracking method. And this comes from some work of tracking people, in particular their limbs and stuff, by learning their appearance. And the idea is they build a person model. And the person model is made up of a couple different things. It's made up of an appearance, we'll talk about what that is in a minute, plus structure, plus dynamics. All right? Now, the structure and dynamics are generic. That is, they are the length of my body. The dynamics are how they can move. So, you know, what are the speeds people tend to move and some of the process noise. But the appearance is person-specific. Okay? So the idea is I'm going to learn the appearance, and then I'm going to do the tracking. And that's represented in this picture here. All right? So the idea is, given some input examples, we build the model. And the model is, like I said, it's generic structure, but we might learn the colors and, you know, the textures of these different parts. And then using that appearance and the structure, we can do the detection running on the new frames. Here's the reference, Ramanand, Forsyth, and Zisserman, and this is showing you them tracking those people parts. And the idea is that they use appearance. That's all I want to talk about that specific method. A bit later, actually, towards the end of this course, we're going to describe some recognition methods that use a lower dimensional space for doing recognition. We've mentioned principal component analysis, etc. Once we do that, we can talk about a couple more, one or two more tracking examples that use a PCA-based description as their appearance model. But until we have that, it would be premature to talk about it. So finally, I just want to talk about a couple of issues that you'll always face when you're doing tracking. So the first one is initialization. How do you start the thing? And there's no good answer. The examples I showed you before were done manually. Somebody says, oh, track that. Okay, so you draw a little circle, say, keep track of that thing. You might have a background subtraction method. Okay, so every now and then you may be able to subtract that a background, find the objects, and say, okay, keep track of that object because it's isolated, and I'm going to track it as it moves along, even when it becomes like partially occluded or with other moving things in the way. Or you might have a detector that can detect things when they're clear and fully visible, right? So I've got a bank robber detector. No, I might have a particular car detector, and I say, oh, a Jeep has just showed up, follow that Jeep. So the detector is running, and it'll only fire sometimes when it gets a good, clear view of something, but then you want to track and follow it through. Next question is, where do you get your sensor and your dynamics models from? Well, we've talked a little bit about this. Your dynamics models, you maybe can learn by essentially from real data. That's generally pretty hard, because if you could track the real data without the dynamics model, you wouldn't be using the dynamics model. So you might use it from clean data. Remember we talked about the girl jumping in front of the black background? That would be some clean data. Or it says here you might specify domain knowledge. That means you're like the smart person. You just write down what it is. Or you take another trip to Delphi and you get another thing from an oracle. Now for the observation model, typically it says generative observation model. What that means is, remember we did the model for the robot sensing distance? So if I knew the wall was 3 meters away, and I take some measurements and I collect them and I get a distribution, now I know what my distribution would be. The trick is I had to know that the thing was actually 3 meters away or 2 meters away, right? I have to know the ground truth. So you have some sort of absolute sensor measurement. Prediction versus correction. So remember this whole thing about tracking and inferences. I make some prediction, I take some measurements, I do my correction. The question is, what's that relative trade-off? Remember we talked about this in Kalman filter, which basically came down to what's the relative size of the noise of my measurements versus the noise of my process? Actually, we usually do the other way around. The noise of my process versus the noise of my measurements. And if one is too strong, you'll ignore the data. If the other is too strong, you'll ignore the predictions. So getting those balanced right is just a little bit of magic that you have to do based upon looking at the data. Here's a more interesting, or I should say fundamental one. It's referred to as data association. Data association basically is, what if we don't know which measurements to associate with which tracks? So up until now, we've pretty much assumed that whatever we've measured is associated with the thing that we're going to, that we want to keep track of. But in reality, there are a couple things that happen. First of all, there can be multiple objects. That's what this cute little airplane thing is supposed to look like. And in fact, radar, which is where the birthplace of multi-hypothesis tracking came from, had this problem, right? I get a whole bunch of pings back. There's a bunch of airplanes. I got to know which pings go with which airplanes in order to track all the different airplanes. Or there can be what's known as clutter. Clutter means there's a lot of stuff in the environment that has nothing to do with me. By the way, the clutter is the basis of camouflage. So when you take a look at this rattlesnake, whose contour you can just barely see here, there's all this other stuff that has nothing to do with it being a snake. So it confuses your visual system. Fortunately, when the snake starts to move, if the brush is not moving also, then you can do the association differently. But in general, clutter means that there are a bunch of measurements that are not from the thing I'm really interested in tracking. The problem is referred to as the data association problem. And the trick is to determine which measurements go with which tracks and which measurements should be ignored. Which measurements cause you to start a new track. These are all things that you have to do when you do tracking. So there is a simple strategy, and that's what's indicated here. I've got a point, and I've got the state. Now I take some measurements. I might just associate, I don't know, the closest measurement to my prediction. So remember when we were tracking the contours for the condensation, Izard and Blake algorithm, right? They took the distance to the nearest strong contour, as if they knew somehow that that was the right contour. They just made that assumption. Unfortunately, that doesn't always work. That clutter problem, in fact, one of the points of clutter is for it to confuse something that's trying to do that association. So those of you who watch Tom Clancy movies or read Tom Clancy books like I've done, et cetera, know that submarines will jettison these things that spin around and make noise and bubbles. At least I assume they do. They did in the movies. They did in the book. Now the torpedoes have a data association problem, right? Which thing that's making noise or making a signal should it decide is the real state? Personally, I would think seeing some, many thousand-ton submarine compared to this little thing spinning around wouldn't have been that hard, but obviously the torpedoes aren't that smart. So it doesn't always work in the presence of clutter. There is a more sophisticated approach to doing this, and that is you do what's called multiple hypothesis. So multiple hypothesis says, well, okay, I've seen two things now, and maybe it's one thing, and I should associate the real object with the left measurement, and the right one is clutter. Maybe it's one thing, and I should associate the object with the right-hand one, and the left one is clutter. Or maybe it's two things. That is, a new thing should get created. Well, like I said, there's this whole area called multi-hypothesis tracking where you try to keep track of all these different things. You actually can do this using particles, all right? You can do particle filtering in a not-so-obvious way, right? Each particle is a hypothesis about the current state. So, for example, a particle can say, oh, there are two such objects, and here's where they are. Or a particle could say, there is one such object, and this one is not the right one, etc. So you can do that using particle filtering. And in fact, I one time told Michael Izard, I said, we were meeting, I said, for a lot of situations, I found that particle filtering was just a convenient way of doing multi-hypothesis tracking. And he said, absolutely. So Michael, if you're out there, I remember that conversation. I think he's on the West Coast having a great time, so good for him. The last issue is what's called drift, okay? Drift is the error that happens, that accumulates over time, that basically what happens is you've got this dynamic model that's making a prediction, and you've got a sensor observation model, et cetera, and you're really caught with two choices, okay? And both of the choices are lousy. Choice one is I stick to my target model, right? I really believe the model. And I never change it, like its appearance or its color distribution. The problem with that is what happens if the object is changing? All of a sudden, it goes in the trees, shadows, things look a little different, and I didn't update my model. So almost every tracker does some form of model update. The problem with that is when you do model update, you run into a situation like this. Okay, so this was actually taken from the Tracking People paper, although they were explaining how not to do tracking. So they've got this little box that's stuck on the middle of the ice skater, and each time they're updating something about the description, and eventually the box slides down, and what's not shown here is it might get stuck on the background markings in the rink. And so what's happened is you keep changing, and all of a sudden, more of the target model came from the rink than came from the skater. So as the skater leaves, the model stays right there. And this is the problem with adaptive tracking. And so all real tracking, in order to fight drift, always has this balance between how quickly or how much do I change my model versus how much do I keep what I had from before. And you might ask, well, how come I didn't see any of this in all that Bayesian stuff that you did? The reason is I gave you this sensor model, P of z given x, and I really didn't tell you how it behaves generically, or I should say all the time. In fact, all we did was we generically gave the algorithm. P of z given x might be how well do I match the pixels. Well, but if the pixels are changing, I have to change my sensor model. So that's the place in the algorithm where that notion of how well do I hold on to my old model versus change it, that's the place where it stays. So that concludes this lesson. It concludes the lesson on tracking. It concludes what seems like months of recording about tracking. Somehow this ended up being a lot, but it's really a cool part of computer vision. You have probabilistic state, you have the notion of measurements, and the idea of combining those to come up with what's really going on in the world, which at its heart is what computer vision is all about. Also, for many of you, even if you don't end up doing computer vision, this idea of maintaining a consistent interpretation over time as something changes becomes important. Whether you're tracking the state of traffic flow over a bridge, whatever it is, this idea of maintaining interesting interpretation over time. So some of the principles we learned here